Mark Evans stood in the middle of what used to be his home, his fingers gripping a thin piece of paper that felt heavier than anything he had ever held. The words, "Final Notice, Eviction in 72 hours," were printed in bold, unforgiving letters, as if the world needed to remind him once again that he had failed. The house was empty now. Most of the furniture was either sold or packed into a small storage unit he could barely afford. In the corner, his wife, Sarah, sat on the bare floor, holding their 5-year-old son, Jake, in her arms. She was whispering something to him, trying to keep him calm, trying to keep herself together. But Mark could see the exhaustion in her eyes. He could see the weight of everything they had lost written all over her face. This was it. They had fought as hard as they could, stretched every dollar, taken every odd job, begged for every extension. But the end had arrived. They had nowhere left to go, no miracle left to hope for. Mark felt his knees weaken as he stumbled onto what was left of the couch, his hands shaking as he ran them over his face. He had never imagined this would be his life. He had always believed in working hard, doing the right thing, pushing forward no matter how difficult things got. But now, sitting in an empty house with an eviction notice in his hands, he realized that sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, life has a way of knocking you down so brutally that standing back up feels impossible. It hadn't always been like this. Just 2 months ago, Mark had a steady job as an aerospace engineer. He was good at it. Damn good at it. He had worked for years to get where he was, spending long nights at the office, missing family dinners, making sacrifices because he believed it was all for something greater. And then, one day, the company shut down. Just like that. No warnings, no safety nets, just a cold, formal email that informed him that his position had been eliminated. At first, he didn't panic. He had savings. He had experience. He would find something else. But weeks turned into months, and job applications turned into rejection letters. The savings he thought would last a year barely stretched beyond a few weeks. And then came Sarah's diagnosis. It started with fatigue, then dizziness, then pain so unbearable that she could barely get out of bed some mornings. The doctors called it a rare neurological disorder, one that required expensive treatments, constant monitoring, and medication that cost more than their rent. They sold the car first, then the jewelry, then the small things, electronics, appliances, anything that could buy them a little more time. But nothing was enough. Debt collectors called daily, medical bills piled up, and before Mark could figure out a way to turn things around, the landlord handed him the final notice. The worst part of it all was Jake. He was 5 years old. He didn't understand what was happening, not really. Mark had told him they were going on a new adventure, that they were just moving to a smaller place for a while. But Jake wasn't stupid. He could see the stress on his parents' faces, hear the whispered arguments at night, feel the tension that never seemed to go away. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, too weak to move, and Jake played with his last remaining toy on the floor, Mark sat at the kitchen table with nothing but his laptop and desperation. He had tried everything. He had reached out to charities, applied for emergency assistance, called every friend he had ever known, but nothing had worked. And so, with nothing left to lose, he did something he never thought he would do. He opened a blank email and typed the name of a man he had never met, a man who had no reason to care, a man who probably wouldn't even see this message: Elon Musk. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, unsure of what to say. Then, with a deep breath, he started typing. Mr. Musk, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if this will even reach you. But I'm writing this because I have no other choice. My name is Mark Evans. I used to be an aerospace engineer. I worked hard, I built things, I was proud of my life. But then I lost my job. My wife got sick. And now, in 5 days, my son and I will be sleeping in our car, because we have nowhere else to go. I know you owe me nothing. I know the chances of this email even being opened are slim to none, but I just needed to try. Because my son is 5, and he deserves better than this. He read the words over 3 times, his chest tightening with every sentence. Then, without letting himself think too much, he hit send. And that was it. He closed the laptop, turned off the lights, and went to bed, knowing deep down that the email would never be answered. Days passed. The eviction date loomed closer. Mark stopped checking his inbox, stopped hoping for some last-minute miracle. The morning of the eviction, he woke up to the sound of Sarah coughing, her body too weak to even sit up. Jake was still asleep, curled up beside her, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Mark didn't wake him. Let him have a little more time before their world fell apart. He walked downstairs, the house eerily silent, and sat at the same kitchen table where he had sent that email. His phone buzzed next to him, but he ignored it. He already knew what it was, a reminder that time was up. But the buzzing didn't stop. Annoyed, he finally glanced at the screen, and then he froze. There was an email. The subject line was simple: "I heard your story." And the sender? Elon Musk. His hands shook as he opened it, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else. The message was short. "Mark, I don't do this often, but sometimes the right people need a second chance. Stay where you are. Help is coming." That was it. No grand explanation, no promises, just a few words that changed everything. He barely had time to process what he was seeing before his phone rang again, this time from an unknown number. He answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hello? Mr. Evans?" A professional-sounding voice on the other end spoke. "I'm calling from Tesla's financial department. A payment has been made on your behalf. Your home is no longer in foreclosure." Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. "What?" "Your mortgage has been paid off," the voice repeated. "You don't owe the bank anything anymore." Mark's vision blurred as the words sank in. He clutched the edge of the table, his entire body shaking. "Who? How?" "I believe you already know," the voice said simply. Mark hung up and stared at the screen, at the email that had somehow made its way from his laptop to the inbox of one of the most powerful men in the world. He didn't understand how it had happened. He didn't know why Musk had chosen to help him. But as he walked upstairs and saw his wife still asleep, his son still dreaming, he realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were safe. What mattered was that against all odds, a stranger had changed their lives with one simple act of kindness. And the most incredible part? The world would never know. Because Musk never spoke about it, never acknowledged it, never sought any recognition. To him, it wasn't about the headlines. It wasn't about the praise. It was just about doing what needed to be done. And in the end, maybe that's what made it truly remarkable. Inside Tesla's headquarters, a low-level assistant named Alex sat at his desk, his eyes scanning through the endless stream of emails flooding the company's inbox. This was his daily routine, sorting through thousands of messages, most of them fan requests, business proposals, or outright absurd demands. 99% of them went straight to the auto-reply folder, where a polite but firm message would let the sender know that their email would never reach Elon Musk. It was a system designed to keep the noise out, to filter the impossible from the important, but somehow, amidst the sea of digital chaos, one email caught his eye. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't marked urgent. It wasn't written in the desperate, pleading tone he had seen too many times before. But something about it, maybe the quiet exhaustion in its words, or the way the sender, Mark Evans, had written not with the expectation of a reply, but simply to have tried, made Alex pause. He almost dismissed it. That's what he was trained to do. Move fast, delete, move on. But instead, he hesitated. Against every protocol, against every reason not to, he clicked forward. It was a simple action, just a quick movement of his mouse, a decision that should have meant nothing. But it was the first in a series of moments that would change everything. The email moved up the chain, landing in the inbox of a mid-level Tesla executive who, much like Alex, wasn't sure what to do with it. It wasn't every day that an email like this made it through the filters. Maybe it was an error. Maybe the system had glitched. But still, something about it lingered in his mind. It wasn't the usual "I need money" message. There was no demand, no expectation, just quiet desperation, A man at the end of his rope trying one last impossible thing before accepting defeat. With a sigh, the executive did what most would never do. He sent it up the chain again. The email, against every odd, was now making its way through Tesla's ranks, moving through departments that had no business dealing with personal pleas. It should have stopped somewhere along the way, lost in the bureaucracy of a billion-dollar empire. But it didn't. Hours later, at SpaceX's headquarters, another employee, a senior executive who had worked with Musk for years, opened his inbox and saw the forwarded message. He frowned, wondering how it had gotten this far. He had seen people try to reach Musk before, politicians, celebrities, world leaders, but this was just an ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances. He didn't know why, but instead of deleting it, he made a decision. He picked up his phone and made a call. It rang twice before being answered. "I think there's something you should see," the executive said simply, forwarding the email once more, this time to an inbox that very few people in the world ever had access to. It was late at night when Elon Musk finally saw the email. His days were consumed by meetings, projects, deadlines, the relentless push forward. But in the quiet hours, when the world slowed just enough, he would sometimes skim through things personally. A habit he had picked up over the years, not because he had time, but because in rare moments, something unexpected would catch his eye. And tonight, something did. He read the email once, then again. There was nothing special about it, no reason it should have made it to him. And yet here it was. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his desk. He knew what this was. He had seen it before. People reaching out, hoping for something, a miracle from a man they didn't know. And most of the time, he had to ignore it. Not because he didn't care, but because if he helped one, he'd have to help them all. That's what people never understood. The weight of expectation, the impossibility of fixing every problem. But this email was different. Maybe it was the way it was written. Maybe it was the simplicity of it. Or maybe it was just one of those rare moments where the universe aligned in a way that couldn't be ignored. Whatever the reason, Musk made a decision. Without hesitation, without consulting anyone, he moved his fingers across the keyboard and typed a reply. "Mark, I don't do this often, but sometimes the right people need a second chance. Stay where you are. Help is coming." He stared at the words for a brief moment before hitting send. And just like that, the course of one man's life shifted in a way that no one could have predicted. The message left his inbox, traveling through encrypted servers, appearing as a simple notification on Mark Evans's phone. Just another unread email among countless eviction warnings and overdue bill reminders. He wouldn't see it immediately. He wouldn't know in that moment that the impossible had happened. That somewhere, in an office far beyond his reach, a decision had been made that would change everything. And Elon Musk? He closed his laptop, exhaled, and moved on to the next task, never thinking twice about what he had just done. Because for him, this wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about the headlines. It was just another decision, another moment, another problem solved before the world ever knew it existed. The next morning, as Mark stood in his nearly empty home, watching the eviction team approach with legal documents in hand, his phone buzzed again. The name on the screen was unfamiliar. He answered hesitantly, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Mr. Evans?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "I'm calling from Tesla's financial division. We received confirmation that your situation has been addressed." Mark frowned, his mind struggling to keep up. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Addressed how?" The voice hesitated. Then, carefully, as if revealing something that shouldn't have been said aloud, the caller continued. "Your debt has been cleared. Your mortgage has been paid in full. Effective immediately, your home is no longer at risk." Silence. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing, trying to make sense of words that felt too good to be true. This has to be a mistake," he whispered. "Who did this?" The pause on the other end of the line was brief but meaningful. "I think you already know." The call ended. Mark sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at his phone, at the email still glowing on the screen. He turned to Sarah, who was watching him with cautious hope, and when he finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. "It's over," he said. "We're safe." Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they weren't from fear or exhaustion. They were from something else entirely. Relief, disbelief, a second chance that had come from the most unexpected place. Outside, the eviction team was still approaching, ready to do their job. But before they could reach the door, another phone call came, this time to the landlord, informing them that the balance had been paid, that the paperwork no longer mattered, that the home, the one they had been about to lose, now belonged to them, free and clear. And Elon Musk? He never spoke about it, never tweeted about it, never sought credit or recognition. Somewhere, in the midst of rockets and self-driving cars, in the chaos of running multiple billion-dollar companies, he had taken a moment, a single moment, to change a life. And then, just as quickly, he had moved on, because to him it wasn't about being seen as a hero, it was just about doing what needed to be done. The morning air felt different. He wasn't sure if it was the silence of the house or the weight in his chest that made it feel heavier than usual. Mark sat on the edge of the worn-out couch, staring at the half-empty suitcase by the door, his hands gripping his knees as if letting go would mean collapsing under the pressure of what was happening. His wife, Sarah, sat quietly on the floor with Jake curled up in her arms. The 5-year-old was still half asleep, his small fingers clutching onto his mother's sweater, unaware that today was the day his world would change forever. The sun streamed through the broken blinds, casting long shadows on the bare walls, making the house feel emptier than it had ever been. This was it, the day they had feared, the day they had fought so hard to stop, the day they had run out of time. The landlord had given them until noon, but Mark knew the eviction team wouldn't wait that long. They never did. Soon there would be a knock at the door, and then a group of men in uniforms would walk in, their voices cold and professional as they carried out their job, removing what little remained of the Evans family's life from this house and locking the door behind them. They wouldn't care about the memories woven into these walls, the first steps Jake had taken in the living room, the laughter that had once filled the air. To them, this was just another job, another house, another family that didn't make the deadline. Mark had tried to prepare himself, to accept that this was happening, but the moment he saw Sarah trying to fold Jake's tiny clothes into a bag that was too small to hold their entire life, something inside him cracked. He had failed. He had done everything he could, and it still wasn't enough. He had spent sleepless nights searching for jobs, applied for every position that even remotely matched his skills, begged the bank for extensions, pleaded with charities, even written an email he knew was pointless. He had held on to hope until the very last second, but hope was cruel. Hope made you believe in miracles that never came. His phone sat face down on the coffee table, silent, mocking him. There would be no last-minute rescue, no sudden change of fate. Just the cold, hard reality that in a few hours, they would be standing on the street with nowhere to go. His breath felt heavy as he ran a hand over his face, his fingers pressing into his temples as if he could physically push away the exhaustion, the anxiety, the fear that had taken root in his chest. Then, his phone buzzed. It was so unexpected, so out of place in the suffocating silence that for a second he didn't react. It wasn't until Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes widening with something that looked dangerously close to hope, that he realized his hands were trembling as he reached for it. He almost didn't want to look. Another reminder from the bank? Another automated message about his overdue balance? He turned it over, his heart already sinking. But then he saw the name on the screen. His breath caught. His pulse pounded in his ears. An email from Elon Musk. The world around him blurred as he tapped the screen, his vision narrowing to the words in front of him. "I heard your story. Stay where you are. Help is coming." His hand shook so badly that he nearly dropped the phone. His chest felt tight, his lungs unable to pull in enough air. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He read it again. And again. The words didn't change. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but then Sarah's voice broke through the fog. "Mark, what does it say?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid that speaking too loudly would shatter whatever fragile miracle was unfolding in front of them. He turned to her, his mouth opening and closing, unable to find the words. Instead, he simply handed her the phone. The moment her eyes scanned the screen, her hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. She looked at him, and in that moment, he saw something he hadn't seen in months. Pure, unfiltered hope. Before either of them could process it, another buzz. This time, a call. Unknown number. Mark hesitated for only a second before answering, his voice unsteady. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Mr. Evans, this is David from Tesla's financial department. I'm calling to confirm that your situation has been addressed." Mark's fingers tightened around the phone. I don't understand." His voice cracked, his mind still trying to catch up with what was happening. The man on the other end didn't pause. "Your mortgage has been paid in full. Your debt is cleared. Effective immediately, your home is no longer at risk." The world tilted. Mark's knees buckled and he collapsed onto the couch, his body shaking. "No," he whispered, as if denying it would keep the universe from taking it away. This isn't possible." But the voice on the phone was steady, unwavering. "It's already done, Mr. Evans. You don't need to worry anymore." Sarah was watching him, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her chest as if trying to keep her heart from bursting out of it. Jake, still groggy, looked between his parents, confused by the sudden shift in energy. Mark didn't know how to explain it to him, didn't know how to make sense of it himself. But then, another buzz. This time, from the landlord. He answered on instinct, bracing himself. "Evans." The voice on the other end sounded different this time, not impatient, not dismissive, almost stunned. "I just got a call from the bank," the landlord said. "Your house, it's paid off. Someone wired the full amount this morning." Mark's grip tightened on the phone, his fingers numb. "Who?" His voice came out broken, barely audible. The landlord let out a breath. "I think you already know." Outside, a car pulled up, not the eviction team, a courier. Mark walked to the door in a daze, opened it, and took the envelope that was handed to him. Inside, a single note. "Consider this a second chance. Use it well." No signature, no explanation, just those words. And just like that, the nightmare was over. The home they thought they had lost, the life they thought had crumbled beneath them, had been restored in a way that didn't feel real. Mark held Sarah and Jake close, his heart pounding in his chest as the reality of what had happened finally settled in. A billionaire, a man they had never met, had changed their lives with a simple email, a silent decision, and an act of kindness that would never make the news. Elon Musk would never talk about it. There would be no press release, no social media announcement, because for him, this wasn't about recognition. It was about action, about doing what needed to be done without expecting anything in return. Mark looked at his son, who smiled up at him, still too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, but one day, he would. And when that day came, Mark would tell him about the time they had lost everything, until a stranger decided to change their fate with a single email, and just like that, they were safe. The story of Mark Evans and his family should have ended there, a miraculous turn of fate that defied all logic, a moment so surreal that even Mark struggled to believe it had really happened. But for those paying attention, those who had watched this kind of thing happen before, it was just another piece of a much larger mystery. Because Mark wasn't the first. He wasn't the only one. Somewhere in a sleek high-rise office at Tesla's headquarters, a journalist named Daniel Whitmore sat staring at his computer screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he tried to make sense of what he had just uncovered. He had started with one simple question. How had a random man, a complete stranger to Elon Musk, managed to have his entire life turned around overnight. The official answer, the one given by Tesla's PR team, was as vague as expected. No comment on private matters. It was the same response they always gave, the same carefully worded dismissal that kept the truth buried beneath layers of silence. But Daniel had been a reporter long enough to know when a story had more beneath the surface. And this? This was different. This was intentional. Someone had made sure there was no trace, no public acknowledgement, no paper trail leading back to Musk. But even the best-kept secrets leave breadcrumbs. His investigation started small. A deep dive into financial records, donations, and trusts linked to Tesla, SpaceX, or Musk personally. Nothing. The man was a fortress when it came to money trails. But then, by sheer luck, Daniel found something. An old, archived financial report buried in the depths of a hospital's annual funding statement. The document listed an anonymous donation, one large enough to cover the medical expenses of nearly 100 pediatric patients. There was no name attached, no corporate sponsor, no charity organization claiming credit. Just a timestamp and a routing number linked to a blind trust. That trust had made similar donations before. Over the years, millions had been funneled through it, always appearing when families were on the brink of losing everything, always arriving just in time to stop an eviction, fund an emergency surgery, or clear a debt that had seemed impossible to escape. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The numbers, the patterns, the secrecy, it all pointed to one person. Determined to find out more, he reached out to sources, former Tesla employees, financial analysts, charity workers, anyone who might know something. Most didn't. Some refused to talk. But then, late one evening, his phone rang. The number was blocked. A quiet, cautious voice spoke on the other end. "You're looking for something you're not supposed to find." Daniel gripped his pen tighter. "And who are you?" The caller exhaled slowly, as if debating whether to continue. "I worked for Tesla's finance department. I don't anymore." A pause. "If you're smart, you'll stop digging." Daniel's pulse quickened. "So it's true?" Another pause. Then just 3 words. "You have no idea." The line went dead, but Daniel's determination had only grown stronger. If what this person was implying was true, then Musk had been quietly altering lives for years, without telling a soul. It wasn't charity the way billionaires usually did it, with press releases and public statements, with staged photos of oversized checks and dramatic handshakes. This was something else entirely, something deliberate, something hidden. Digging deeper, Daniel finally tracked down someone willing to talk, a former SpaceX engineer who had worked directly under Musk for years. He agreed to meet in person, away from phones and emails, away from anything that could be traced. They sat across from each other in a dimly lit cafe, the engineer stirring his coffee absent-mindedly before finally breaking the silence. "He never talks about it," the man said. "Never wants anyone to know. But I've seen it. We all have." Daniel leaned in. "Seen what?" The engineer hesitated. "The calls, the emails, the times he steps in when no one else will." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "It's always quiet, always private. If someone brings it up, he shuts it down immediately. But I can tell you this, he's helped more people than anyone realizes." The engineer told him about the time Musk had overheard an employee talking about his wife's cancer treatment being denied by insurance. 2 days later, the hospital called, saying the bill had been paid in full, an anonymous donor. Another story surfaced about a university student drowning in student loan debt, unable to finish his degree. His remaining tuition? Cleared overnight. No explanation, no receipts. Just a simple email from a private financial firm confirming the balance had been settled. The deeper Daniel dug, the more stories he found, all disconnected, yet following the same pattern. There was no press coverage, no tweets, no grand gestures, just silent acts of kindness, happening in the shadows, leaving behind nothing but changed lives. One night, after weeks of chasing leads, Daniel received an email from an untraceable account. It contained only one sentence. The biggest impact isn't in what you see, it's in what you don't. It didn't take a genius to figure out who had sent it. Musk knew someone was looking, knew someone had put the pieces together, and yet instead of shutting it down, instead of denying it or trying to hide, he had simply left a message, a confirmation, in its own way, that some things are meant to stay in the dark. Daniel sat back, staring at the screen, realizing the enormity of what he had uncovered. He could write the story. He had enough to prove that Musk had been quietly transforming lives for years. But would it matter? Musk wouldn't acknowledge it. He wouldn't go on record. And if the world knew, would it even believe it? Or would it twist the truth, turn it into another narrative, another debate, another controversy? Maybe that's why Musk never spoke about it. Maybe he knew that the moment people knew, it wouldn't be about the people he had helped anymore. It would be about him. And so Daniel did something he never thought he would do. He closed his laptop, deleted the draft. He wouldn't write the story. Some truths, he realized, were meant to be left untouched. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about exposing a secret. It was about understanding why it had to stay one. Somewhere, in a house that had been saved, Mark Evans tucked his son into bed, unaware that his story was one of many. In a hospital room across the country, a mother held her child, the weight of medical bills no longer crushing her spirit. And in an office filled with plans for Mars colonization and sustainable energy, a man who could change the world with a single email moved on to his next task, never once looking back. Because real generosity doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs action. The question was bound to come. It had been weeks since whispers began surfacing, stories of anonymous donations, of debts mysteriously cleared, of struggling families saved at the last possible second by an invisible hand that never sought recognition. The Mark Evans story had been the catalyst, the moment that forced people to ask, who is behind this? And while no one could prove it, while no financial records bore his name and no public statements confirmed his involvement, there was only one answer that made sense. It had to be him. Elon Musk. The speculation had reached a boiling point, and now, sitting in a sleek, minimalist conference room during a Tesla earnings call, Musk faced a journalist who had finally dared to ask the question out loud. The room was silent as the words hung in the air. Mr. Musk, there have been rumors. Stories of families saved, medical bills paid, homes rescued from foreclosure, all funded by anonymous donations. Many believe you're responsible. Can you confirm or deny? The journalist's voice was steady, professional, but there was a flicker of something more. Genuine curiosity. Musk sat still, his fingers lightly drumming on the table, his expression unreadable. The cameras were rolling, the world was watching, waiting for an answer. The easy thing to do, the expected thing, would be to deny it, to brush it off, to deflect, to shift the conversation back to Tesla's quarterly performance, the future of self-driving technology, or the latest SpaceX mission. But he didn't do any of that. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he simply paused. It was just a fraction of a second, a moment so small that most people might not have noticed. But to those who had been searching for the truth, it was everything. Then, finally, he let out a small breath, barely a smile ghosting his lips, and with the same quiet confidence that had defined his career, he said, "Next question." The room buzzed with murmurs, journalists exchanging glances, knowing exactly what had just happened. He hadn't confirmed it, he hadn't denied it, but his silence had said more than words ever could. And that was the moment it became clear. Elon Musk would never admit to what he had done. Not now, not ever. Because for him, this wasn't about being seen as a hero. It wasn't about headlines or public recognition. It was about impact. It was about doing what needed to be done without expectation, without applause, without turning human suffering into a PR campaign. Behind the scenes, those who had worked with him knew this side of him well. He had always been unconventional, always operating on his own terms, and this quiet generosity, was no different. Former employees at Tesla and SpaceX whispered about moments they had witnessed, moments that had never made the news. There was the time an engineer had confided in a colleague about his wife's aggressive cancer, about how their insurance had refused to cover an experimental treatment. 2 days later, the hospital called. The bill had been paid in full by an anonymous donor. The family never found out who had done it, but those in the office knew. It was the same with the janitor at the Tesla gig factory who had lost his home in a fire, the intern who couldn't afford tuition, the security guard who had been drowning in medical debt after a car accident. Each time the solution appeared quietly, efficiently without warning, and each time Musk never spoke about it. It wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he cared too much to make it about himself. He had seen how philanthropy worked in the world of billionaires, how donations were turned into marketing campaigns, how charity galas were more about flashing wealth than solving real problems, how giving had become another way to brand oneself as good rather than simply doing good. Musk had no interest in any of that. He didn't need his name on hospital wings or scholarship funds. He didn't need awards or interviews praising his generosity. He needed results. He needed to know that when a family was about to lose everything, they wouldn't. That when a child needed life-saving treatment, they would get it. And if that meant never taking credit, never letting the world know what he had done, then so be it. The journalist who had asked the question knew what Musk's response had meant. He knew that silence could be louder than words, that a single pause could confirm what no statement ever could. But that didn't stop him from digging deeper. In the days following the press conference, he spoke to financial experts trying to trace the donations. But Musk was meticulous. The transactions were routed through blind trusts, offshore accounts, and private charitable funds, all designed to keep the donor's identity hidden. Even the recipients were often bound by non-disclosure agreements, instructed never to reveal how their debts had vanished, who had stepped in to help. It was a system built not for exposure but for pure, undiluted generosity. And still, the evidence was everywhere. In the small towns where struggling single mothers found their rent suddenly paid, in the hospitals where children received treatments their families could never have afforded, in the classrooms where students who had nearly dropped out due to financial struggles suddenly found their tuition cleared. The impact was undeniable, and yet the man behind it remained in the shadows, his name whispered but never confirmed. For Musk, this was just another day, another problem solved, another crisis averted. He didn't wake up thinking about legacy or how history would remember him. He thought about problems, about solutions, about how to build a future where people didn't need miracles to survive, where innovation and progress weren't just for the elite, but for everyone. That was the goal. That was the mission. The money? The wealth? It was a tool, nothing more. And when that tool could be used to change lives, why wouldn't he use it? The world continued to speculate. Analysts debated whether his fortune was being used in ways no one had expected. Some called him reckless, some called him a genius, some called him both. But in the end, none of it mattered. Because for every headline questioning his decisions, there was a child going to sleep in a home they had almost lost. For every debate about his motives, there was a student holding a diploma they never thought they'd earn. For every article trying to unravel the mystery, there was a mother breathing a sigh of relief because someone, somewhere, had taken her burden away. And Elon Musk? He never said a word about it. He never would. Because true generosity doesn't need validation. It doesn't need a stage. It just needs to be done. The house still stood, not as a reminder of the past struggles, but as a silent testament to the power of an unseen kindness, a second chance given by a man who never asked for recognition. Mark Evans sat on the front porch watching the late afternoon sun dip behind the horizon, the golden light casting long shadows across the quiet street. The world had moved on, the chaos of eviction notices and unpaid bills now nothing more than a distant nightmare. Yet every now and then he would look at his son, now older, stronger, carrying a light in his eyes that had almost been extinguished in those dark days, and he would remember. He would remember the hopelessness, the weight of knowing that no matter how hard he fought, he was losing the battle. He would remember the way his hands had trembled when he read that email, the way Sarah had collapsed in relief, the way his knees had given out when he heard the words, "It's done. Your home is safe." He had spent months trying to understand why. Why him? Why had his email, out of the thousands Musk must receive every day, been the one that was answered? There was no logic to it, no formula to explain how, in a world where so many suffered, a single decision had changed everything for him and his family. But maybe that was the point. Maybe some things weren't meant to be understood. Maybe some acts of kindness weren't meant to be questioned, only accepted. Life had not magically become perfect after that day, but it had become bearable, livable, hopeful. Sarah continued her treatments, her health improving little by little, and while the struggle wasn't completely gone, they now had time. Time to breathe, time to heal, time to build something new. And that, more than anything, was what Musk had given them. Not just money, not just a house, but time. The kind of time that people take for granted until it's slipping through their fingers like sand. The kind of time that allows a father to watch his son grow up, a husband to sit beside his wife without the crushing fear of losing her to a disease that he couldn't afford to fight. The kind of time that turns desperation into possibility. There were days when Mark would sit in his car, hands gripping the wheel, thinking about driving to Tesla's headquarters, finding Musk and thanking him in person, but every time he stopped himself. Because deep down, he knew. He knew that Musk had done this not for gratitude, not for acknowledgement, but because it was simply what needed to be done. That was the most incredible part of it all. Musk had the power to change lives in ways that most people couldn't even fathom, and yet he chose to do it in silence, never speaking about it, never asking for anything in return. And that was the true mark of greatness. Not wealth, not fame, but the ability to give without expectation. Years passed, and Mark's son, Michael, grew into a young man with a fire in his heart, a belief that the world was still filled with good people, that miracles weren't just fairy tales, but something real, something tangible. He had been too young to understand what had happened back then, too small to grasp the weight of what had nearly been lost. But as he got older, he began asking questions. "Dad, how did we get through it? How did we keep our home?" And every time Mark would hesitate. How do you explain something like that to a child? How do you put into words the kind of generosity that defies explanation? But one night, as they sat in the backyard under a sky full of stars, Mark finally told him the truth. There are people in this world, Michael, who do things not because they have to, not because they want attention, but simply because they can. And one of those people saved us. His son frowned, confused. But why? Why would someone do that for us? Mark let out a small, breathless laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'll never know. And that's what makes it even more incredible." Michael listened, his young mind trying to process something so grand, so incomprehensible. And then, with the innocence only a child could have, he asked, "Did you ever say thank you?" Mark's chest tightened at the question. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once trembled in despair, that had clutched that eviction notice with the knowledge that everything was about to be taken from him. He thought about the email, the call, the moment he realized they had been saved. And he thought about the man behind it all, the man who had given them a future without ever asking for acknowledgement. "No," Mark said finally, his voice soft. "I never did." Michael looked puzzled. "But don't you want to?" Mark smiled then, a quiet, knowing smile. "I think I already have." Because that was the truth of it. The best way to thank someone who had given you a second chance was to use it well, to live a life worthy of the sacrifice, to carry forward the kindness that had been given without expectation. Mark had spent years wondering why Musk had chosen to help him, but now he understood. It wasn't about who was helped. It was about helping where it mattered, and maybe, just maybe, that was a lesson worth passing on. the world would never know how many lives Musk had touched, how many people had been given hope in their darkest moments because of a single unseen act of generosity. But in quiet homes, in hospital rooms, in the hearts of families who had been saved, his legacy lived on. Not in headlines, not in awards, but in the simple, undeniable truth that he had made a difference. That he had used his power not just to build rockets and revolutionize industries, but to quietly, silently, change lives. And maybe that, more than anything else, would be the greatest thing he had ever done. Some people give for applause, some people give for legacy, but the rarest ones, they give because they can, without expecting anything in return. This isn't just a story about Elon Musk. This is a story about the kind of kindness the world desperately needs. Silent, selfless, and real. Imagine if more people in power chose to act like this. Imagine if more of us, no matter how big or small, chose to help when we had the chance. Maybe we can't change the whole world, but we can change someone's world, one act at a time. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let people know that true generosity still exists, even in the most unexpected places, because sometimes the quietest heroes leave the loudest impact.